Hello, once again, my friends. How are you? I'm very well. Thanks for asking. As you can see, I'm not in my office this time. I'm here in the IEA. Got some IEA publications here, including one of mine, I see. And we've got a guest who actually used to work at the IEA. He's now over in America at the Cato Institute. He has recently published a fantastic book, which I think I mentioned in a YouTube video quite recently, Economics in One Virus. He is none other than Ryan Bourne. Ryan, how's it going?
It's going great, Chris. Things are kind of normalizing here, slowly but surely, and it's good to be back with you at the IEA.
And you're in Washington. You've been in America now for a few years. How are you finding it?
It's good. I mean, Washington, as you can imagine, is a very government-centric city, which is not always the easiest place to be for a libertarian. I enjoy the weather. I enjoy the kind of extreme heat in summer. I have a nice rooftop pool, which is nice, and this year we're actually getting to use it. So things are going okay. Things are going okay. We've pretty much been back to normal since late May, really, is when most of the business restrictions were removed. And actually, DC, in comparison to many other US states, you hear about things being very locked down in New York and California. Pretty much since last May, really, we've had pretty stable regulatory environment where COVID is concerned, lots of quite easily available testing. So there are much worse places to be than DC.
And have you had a full lockdown in the last 6 months in DC?
No, not really a full lockdown. There was a period over the Christmas period and then January and early February where restaurant capacity was constrained for a while. Restaurants weren't able to have indoor dining, but we haven't actually had like a stay-at-home order since I think late April, May last year. So it seemed extraordinary watching the debate in the UK and how different it's been to what I've been experiencing here.
Why do you think that is? Because that's true of a lot of US states, right? That they kind of had the full lockdown last year. Most of them haven't really had one since. People keep going on about Florida and Texas being these bastions of freedom. They're doing really, really well. The Dakotas have had like one of the worst outbreaks in the world, but apparently they're a success story because they haven't had a lockdown for ages. What are we to make of this? Anything?
Well, it's quite hard to discern obvious like public policy lessons. I mean, people have this tendency to just kind of conflate the extent of lockdown restrictions over the whole period, compare it to deaths, and say there are no evident obvious lessons. I think that breaks down a bit if you kind of split those into different time periods. Obviously, there were lots of the northeastern states last year that were hit pretty early on, and this thing was spreading out of control before people realized the extent of the damage it was going to do. So those areas, even though they've had strict lockdowns since, have pretty high death tolls and have had pretty high death tolls for a long period of time. Then you had other states which kind of had moderate kind of summer outbreaks last year, Florida and Arizona, and that tended to be during a time period where it actually got so hot in those places that people then spent more time indoors in air-conditioned environments. But if you look over that kind of period from May to December, it does actually appear to be the case that areas that had stricter restrictions did relatively better in terms of cases and deaths in that period. You mentioned South Dakota. They not only had a pretty bad outbreak, I think it was from around September, October last year, but actually, if you look at the proportion of those deaths that were actually among the elderly, the people that we're supposed to be like protecting in a focused way, that was actually higher in South Dakota than the US as a whole. So there wasn't much focused protection there, even though there was a kind of more open environment. And since then, it's been a bit more sporadic, really, and you've had outbreaks in certain areas. I think in other areas of the country there's a degree of herd immunity already because this has swept through pretty dramatically. But over the last kind of month or so, cases have fallen to pretty low levels. As yet, we don't appear to have a big problem like the Delta variant that the UK is experiencing. And I'm not entirely clear why that is. There have been cases of the Delta variant, but it doesn't appear to have taken off in the same way. Whether that's just luck or whether that's the fact that vaccines have been available for everybody over 16 for a couple of months now has meant that there's kind of more circuit breakers in terms of people at all levels of ages, and even many school children who are kind of breaking up the transmission in a way that it's still spreading pretty dramatically among young people in the UK. I don't know, but as of now, things look relatively under control, and let's hope it stays that way.
It seems like the mask issue is kind of a bigger culture war issue in America than it is in the UK. I know that the mask mandates differ massively around the country. In the UK, I don't know how seriously people take them. You do see a surprising number of people wearing them outdoors voluntarily, but like the law only really applies to public transport and popping into a shop. So it's largely theatrical, really, in my opinion. And it's a bit of a nuisance, but it's not, not a hill to die on, in my opinion, although I'd like to get rid of that law quite soon. Whereas in America, people really get very angry about it, don't they? All very protective about it.
Yeah, it seems to be much more of a totemic issue. And I think in part that's because Donald Trump made such a big thing about not wanting to wear masks, so it became a political issue. Of course, that wasn't helped by the fact that very publicly Anthony Fauci and the Surgeon General Jerome Adams last February and I think into very early March were explicitly telling people not to wear masks because they thought it didn't help in containing the spread within the community. That's because they didn't believe it was this thing was spread asymptomatically. Of course, we now know that sadly that's not the case. But you combine those two things together, and the kind of flip-flopping on masks from the public health officials combined with Trump not wanting to wear them, and it's become a lot more of a politically charged issue. That said, a lot of people that I speak to that have traveled back and forth between the US and UK, mainly journalists, because they're one of the groups that are able to do so, seem to suggest that among US cities, at least, mask wearing behavior is a lot stronger, or has been a lot stronger through the pandemic than in the UK. And indeed, one of the reasons why one of the kind of incentives that public health officials here have been pushing to encourage more waverers to get vaccinated has been to say, once you're vaccinated, you don't need to wear a mask at all anymore. So that kind of shows you, I think, how much more of a big issue mask wearing has been in comparison to you over there.
Yeah, now let's talk about your book explicitly. That's not what it's called. It's called Economics in One Virus. It's a great read, Ryan. I read it a couple of months ago when it came out. And I mean, you go through, it's a clever book because you're teaching many of the fundamental lessons of economics via the example of COVID-19. And I hope people will continue to read it years after COVID-19 is forgotten about. And you've kind of been a voice of reason throughout this pandemic, I would say. You've been one of the most kind of articulate people there trying to look at this as calmly and rationally as possible. And it's not always easy to be calm in the midst of a pandemic. And you kind of pick through various different policies, some of which you kind of approve of. You can see the merit of, some of which you think go too far. What do you think is if you had to pick from all these, however many chapters, 20 chapters or so, 16 chapters, what do you think is the main lesson? What's the main thing from an economics perspective that governments have ignored and we would have been better off if they had paid a bit more attention to it?
I think if you look at the most meaningful lesson across the whole pandemic, really, we could take this at different stages. I think the most meaningful lesson across the whole pandemic is that this COVID crisis was fundamentally an information problem. There are a bunch of people walking around who are infectious with the disease. And if one was able to identify who they were and the stage at which they were infectious and get them to isolate, then you'd have much less of a problem for a large extent of the pandemic and massively reduce the transmission of the virus. So if you're looking kind of big picture, Taiwan, South Korea, other countries appeared to identify that pretty quickly. And as a result, even though they've had their own struggles at various times, overall they've had a much more successful pandemic, not just in terms of fewer cases and deaths as a proportion of the population, but also less in the way of ongoing economic damage as well. Now, that said, once this was out and into the community, there were obviously completely different challenges. And you do get to a stage where if you don't have that infrastructure built up, you have to take alternative approaches. I think beyond that, the main lesson that kind of underpins many of the mistakes is just a complete inability to think about costs and benefits or risks and benefits in a rational way. We've seen that more recently with the pausing of the vaccine rollout here with Johnson and Johnson. We saw it with early testing regulations here, where the FDA actually threw up new barriers to getting PCR tests approved on the basis that if there was faulty information about the state of the pandemic, then that might lead to public health mistakes. Well, you know what's even worse for faulty information about the state of the pandemic than having slightly inaccurate tests on the market is having no tests on the market. So this inability to kind of define the counterfactuals such that you can really think about the costs and benefits of different policies or different regulations accurately, I think is the ongoing mistake. And then the second one, I think, that kind of underpins a lot of the examples I write about is how in government there are all sorts of incentives that mean you don't get the rapid error correction that often we see in ordinary markets in the economy. And I've just seen an example of this today. The fact that Public Health England's guidance in the UK still seemed about close contact still seems to be predicated on this just spreading primarily spreading as through droplets rather than aerosols. And that inability to kind of correct quickly in light of new information, I think, is something that's cropped up again and again too.
And this is in relation to the Scottish player whose name I forget. What's he called?
And Billy Gilmore, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the story here is that 2 England players have been told or advised by Public Health England that they should isolate because they came into face-to-face contact and hugged Billy Gilmore after the European Championship game between England and Scotland. But weirdly, no Scottish players nor the Scottish manager have been told to isolate, despite the fact that they spent a huge amount of time in the changing room with this player and obviously been staying in the same hotel and everything.
And hugging him, right?
And hugging him, but not directly face to face, apparently.
Oh, is that the difference? I see.
And so I kind of dug around on this and thought, how on earth can that be the case that the England players are having to isolate and not the Scottish players? And the explanation that I saw on the BBC site, at least, is that Public Health England's guidance suggests that you're regarded as a close contact if you're within 2 meters of someone for more than 15 minutes, or you have a direct face-to-face conversation with them. Now, I think it stretches credulity to believe that no Scotland player spent more than 15 minutes within 2 meters of Billy Gilmore, given they spent so long in the changing rooms or whatever. But let's put that aside. The fact that at this stage of the pandemic, we're still acting as if, with that guidance, we're still acting as if this cannot be spread by aerosols that hang in the air for long periods of time. It's just completely remarkable to me.
It is pretty incredible. As a kind of libertarian free market economist, I mean, we can certainly pick a lot of holes in the way that governments have behaved and big agencies have behaved, and maybe we can, use some traditional libertarian arguments and understanding to critique that. But how many kind of libertarian free market messages are there in this? It's quite difficult to pick many examples and say, well, if only we'd been more libertarian about this, or if only we'd been more free market and let businesses decide or what have you, then things would have been better. But I guess you can find some. Can you, Ryan?
I think there are some. I think the key libertarian argument that I would highlight is the fact that real resilience in a crisis comes from an economy being flexible and adaptive. I think you've seen this in the US to a certain extent, where rather than go down the furlough route, the federal government here decided to pay pretty substantive unemployment insurance benefits. Now, they did that on the basis that actually, in part, policymakers can't identify where the economy is going to go in future. And while there are clearly benefits to keeping workers attached to firms, it may be that this pandemic fundamentally changes demands and supplies through the economy and where labor is required. And I think the US economy is adjusted pretty quickly as a result of that. But more broadly, I think that, a lot of people who are not libertarians are recognizing that the regulatory state can be a real barrier to change, and particularly medical innovation in a crisis. And sometimes it takes a crisis to highlight that there are fundamentally kind of flawed regulatory models in different things. And through this crisis out here, we've seen a whole host of regulations that we would dub never needed that have had to be relaxed in order to enable people to still see their doctor, to be able to work from home effectively in many industries, relaxations of occupational licensing and the ability of businesses to sell alcohol and the like. So we've seen that, but people have also recognized that there's kind of an invisible graveyard or invisible amounts of illness created by a lot of the regulatory hurdles that medical innovations have to go through. And here we're not just talking about, drugs, which of course we all want to be tested to an extent that we know that they're safe, but things like being able to undertake a personal test of your COVID status at home. The alternative to that for many people, the alternative to doing a kind of 15-minute lateral flow test at home is often just waking up and deciding, how do I feel today, or testing your temperature. Now, clearly, the lateral flow test is a marginal improvement on that for most people, provided you give proper guidance about how it should be used or whatever. But I think, put those two things together, the damage that a lot of these medical regulations have done in slowing down things that could have eased the tensions between economic activity and public health on the margins, combined with a whole bunch of regulations that were never needed. I think we have a good story to tell on the regulatory state coming out of this. And I think that's kind of the margin that I would be pushing on.
The example of government failure that jumped out of your book at me was price gouging laws, which we don't really go for in the UK, but the US tends to get quite excited about them from time to time. Can you just tell us the unintended consequences of the price gouging laws during the pandemic?
Yeah, sure. Well, the CMA actually demanded those price gouging powers early in the crisis when Andrew Tyree was still the chair, but thankfully I don't think the government has given them yet. So almost all states here, I think it's around 40 states, have laws on their statute books where when an emergency is triggered, if certain prices go above what's regarded as an unconscionable level, or in some states it's dictated at an absolute level of 10%. If you see significant price rises, particularly of goods that are regarded as very much needed in the emergency, then you can get fined if you charge more than those limits. And this creates a whole bunch of uncertainties for business. It obviously works as an effective price cap on what they're able to charge. And as a result of that, it dampens the price signal. As demand rises and you have relatively sturdy supply, we would imagine in the short term that prices would rise. That would encourage more entrepreneurs and businesses to turn their hand to producing that product, because it's now more profitable for them to do so, or might even go from being uneconomic to economic for them to do so. And so you see supply rising to meet that new demand. Now, as a result of a combination of these anti-price gouging laws, combined with the fact that lots of companies perceive it to be reputationally harmful to raise prices, we actually saw sustained shortages of many products, hand sanitizer, face masks for a relatively long period. But a whole host of other sectors as well were affected, ones that you might not even think about, like car hire, for example, which fell under these laws in many states. And as a result, we saw sustained shortages and consumer demands not being served. And I think during a crisis, we seem to forget the role that prices play in a free market economy. That changing prices reflect a reality of supply and demand. Businesses can't charge whatever they like; they're disciplined by competition, and that within those price movements, there's an incentive to provide more to the market, or provide less if the market is demanding less. And for some reason, as human beings, when a crisis like this hits, we forget all of that. And of course, it's completely asymmetric the way that we forget all of that. We weren't bemoaning the fact that airline prices were collapsing last year. We weren't bemoaning the fact that filling your car up with petrol was much less expensive. We weren't saying, oh, this is so harmful, we're kind of gouging on these producers. But of course, we don't like big observable increase in prices. So those price gouging laws can cause unnecessary dislocation that actually lead to consumer demands not being met and sustained shortages of important products. And in some cases can actually, I'm sorry, I know I'm going on here, but in some cases they can actually harm public health as well. Because if you have a situation where somebody really does need a product, and as a result of sustained shortages, they're going from store to store trying to find that product. There have been some studies that have suggested that in states with anti-price gouging laws, people spent more time in stores being close to other people. And as a result, it could have worsened the public health outcomes as well.
That is a good point, and exactly the kind of thing that I wouldn't have thought of. And this book is just full of unintended consequences, and that's, to me, what economics really is all about. It's the clash between well-meaning policies, like let's make sure that everyone can afford face masks, and the unintended consequences, which is somebody just stockpiles one of the face masks and either doesn't use them or sells them on the black market for even more money. I think the one thing that people want to know from economists during this pandemic is whether the lockdowns are worth it in economic terms, not just in financial terms, but in broad economic terms. And that really was the question that the lockdown skeptics started with kind of this time last year, before they just went completely off the rails and started arguing about reality. But I think it's a fair point. And I mean, you acknowledge it's a fair point. And I notice in the book, you don't attempt to answer that question, per se. You give a few figures that people have bandied around as being the potential savings and the costs of lockdown. But it's very clear reading your chapter on this that it's almost impossible to do, because not only have you got to put a value on human life, which is a very arbitrary thing to do in the first place. And I think you're a bit more open to the idea of value of statistical life than I am, probably. But whatever you think of it, it's inevitably arbitrary. And in a way, that's the easy bit, because you then got to work out, for example, you say we need to put a value on losing a sense of smell or taste. Then there's benefits like reduced pollution, the restoring of natural habitats. You've got inherently subjective costs and benefits. You've got, what have we got here? Loss of schooling, loss of potential business and enterprise from people not being able to socialize in bars and this kind of thing. I mean, it just goes on. And then potentially you've got, CO2 reductions and all this. I mean, as far as I can tell, it's basically impossible to do this. Well, let me put it away. It's possible to do it because people try and put together cost benefit analysis of anything, but you can produce any figure you want, couldn't you?
I think it is really, really hard to do. And I haven't seen anybody actually attempt to do it in a way that I would consider comprehensive or well. I think there's a few different reasons for that. One of the main ones is that defining the counterfactual world is really hard. And that's what you need to do in order to work out how many lives are saved from an epidemiological model in some sense. So, in the absence
and you're fairly scathing about those models in the book as well, aren't you? You don't seem to be a huge fan.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't incorporate. I mean, the main economic critique of them is that they didn't incorporate how people's behavior would change with the prevalence of the disease, and I think that's a fair point. No country, as far as I'm aware, has had one wave where they've reached herd immunity in one go, which was predicted by a lot of the basic epidemiological models early in the crisis. So, the fact that we have those waves suggests that as the prevalence of the disease changes, as people become more worried about this, they eventually take evasive action, they social distance more, they wear masks, or they do everything else. So defining that counterfactual is really hard. Putting a value, as you say, on the lost liberties is incredibly difficult. The lost liberties that go beyond the losses of GDP. So I know people that have missed their grandparents' funerals out here in the States because of state lockdown restrictions. How do you put a value on not being able to say goodbye emotionally to a grandparent? That's incredibly difficult, but it's something that you have to think about. And then thirdly, there's lots of, as you say, these dynamic effects that we don't really know as yet what the impact's going to be. How much is the absence of schooling going to harm children's human capital development as they move through their careers. People have tried to look at past studies of lost schooling, where you compare what happens to somebody who missed a year of school compared to others in their cohort that haven't, and come to massively high figures. I think the Institute for Fiscal Studies have been kind of pushing these figures. But is that really the same as a whole cohort missing a year of school when employers and businesses are aware of what happened in 2020? How much of education is really human capital development? How much is signaling? That's a kind of open question. And of course, there's another uncertainty about the dynamic impact, which is how much will this experience actually have scarred entrepreneurial willingness to engage in certain activities and risky investments. I imagine if you were the sort of person that a couple of years ago was considering trying to do something revolutionary in the leisure or hospitality sector, you might not have even been aware of the fact that a global pandemic could have shuttered your industry, your would-be industry, for a year and a half. So the willingness of people to engage in certain activities, I think, is going to be diminished too. So what I really try and do in that book chapter is set out a framework for thinking about this question. I think as more data comes in, there will be people that will have better attempts at it than those so far. But just comparing, as many have, the kind of value of a statistical life, multiplying it by the number of lives saved by lockdowns from these basic epidemiological models, and then comparing that to lost GDP, I just don't think that's a satisfactory way of trying to answer this question.
We'll never really know, will we, whether it was worth it or if in fact we should have just let it rip.
Well, given that we're still debating like the 1930s, whether the New Deal helped or hindered the recovery, I imagine that we'll be still having this debate in 70 to 80 years as well.
I imagine so. We're nearly out of time, Ryan. Before you go, I just wanted to ask you about sports. I know you're a big fan of football. The one thing that puts me off moving to America, not that it had me, but I love America. But the one thing that I don't think I could put up with long term is I don't like any of their sports. And they're pretty keen on sport, but baseball is boring. American football is incomprehensible. Basketball's okay, I guess. It's probably best of a bad bunch. Have you got into any American sport? Or are you just sticking with watching the UK Soccer League?
Well, I'll say a couple of things on that. I mean, the first one is, given that you're a big proponent of watching on TV rather than going to the game, actually you can squeeze in a few Premier League games before lunchtime here, given the time difference.
That's too early to me. That's the problem. Waking up early, going to an Irish bar, it's not the same.
Well, maybe not. So it actually does make it incredibly difficult to watch all of the European Championships because it's like 9, 12, and 3, which is basically the whole workday if you wanted to follow this closely. I've actually, to the extent I've got into American sports, I haven't been able to discern what goes on in American football. The baseball, I think once you get into it to a certain extent, it's kind of got a similar ambience to cricket, albeit I don't think as skillful.
They never hit the ball. They never hit the ball. In cricket, they usually hit the ball, often hit the ball at least.
Yeah, you don't get the same degree of uncertainty with any given ball, but the actual kind of, it's more about just going and having drinks and eating.
Exactly, eating.
It's kind of like going to county.
Eating.
Yeah, it's more like going to like a county cricket match with a picnic or something, albeit you're paying for overpriced food within the stadium. But the one that I've actually got into here, mainly because the team is pretty successful, is actually the NHL ice hockey. The Washington Capitals actually won the Stanley Cup a couple of years ago whilst I was here. That was pretty exciting. It's a very fast-paced game.
Yeah.
Lots of activity.
Similar idea to football. I see the
lots of fights.
A lot of fights. Well, they still have lots of fights. Good. Pleased to hear it.
Yeah, I'd say once every couple of matches you have a big dust up. So it's good fun.
And who do you think is going to win the Euros?
I've actually been very impressed so far by the Netherlands. They've kind of surprised me with how slick their kind of attacking play is. I know they've surprised a few of the Dutch guys out here as well. So I think they're my dark horse. It's difficult to look that much beyond France or Belgium other than that. They're certainly the most ruthless teams when they've kind of been pegged back so far. So I'd say one of those three.
I've wasted a lot of money on Holland over the years backing them. I always think they're going to be there. They're often quite close, aren't they? Like the style of play, but they never do it. So maybe this year I haven't put any money on. They'll probably win it. Good luck to to Holland. Good luck to your team, whoever it is out there. Thank you very much, Ryan. Great talking to you. Please go out or get on Amazon, get Ryan's book, Economics of One Virus. It is an indispensable read. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another special guest. So thank you to all our IEA online patrons supporting our digital work, especially those VIP level patrons such as Timothy Worrell, Mark Edwards and James Burns. See you next time.